Welcome to Learning for All's first parent webinar of the school year. And this parent webinar tonight is on what is dyslexia. It's great to see so many participants. I see a lot of our current parents in the audience tonight, as well as community members and some of our professional members as well. So thank you all for being here. It's such a privilege that you would share your evening with me. My name is Rachel Herman. I am the founder and executive director of Learning for All, and it's my privilege to be here tonight to share with you a little bit more on the topic of what is dyslexia. So just to get started, we're going to cover a couple kind of housekeeping items. We're going to go ahead and have our participants unmute. We also will be recording this webinar for those that couldn't be here in person this evening. So we'll be passing on that link at the end, or if you would like to pass this webinar on and share it with someone, you'd be more than welcome to do that as well. Throughout the evening, we have Erin Sensiba, our clinical director. She's also here online with us tonight, and she will be recording questions. So if you have questions throughout the evening as we go through the process, my video is off. Erin's telling me I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty seeing my Zoom. So I'm going to stop that for a second. There you are. Hello. Now I can see. Now I can see you. Sorry about that. I'm going to share my screen in just a minute. There we go. There's Erin. Erin saying hi. She's our clinical director. She'll be on the line kind of managing the logistics of our program tonight and also taking questions. So if you have quick questions, please go ahead and throw those in the chat. Erin might just answer them in real time, but she'll also be taking questions for the end of the evening. So we're going to end with a question and answer time, and we'll be able to get to as many questions as we can that come into the chat throughout the evening. So I think that's all the housekeeping I have. Great. All right. So I am going to go back and share my screen. And Erin, I can't see for some reason. I don't know why it won't let me see my Zoom screen when I go to full screen, but so I might toggle back and forth. So, but let me go ahead and share again. And we'll get started here. All right. Oh, good. Now it seems to be working. Perfect. Now I can see you and I can see my screen. That's always a plus. Tonight's roadmap, we're going to be covering the topic of what is dyslexia. And we're going to be talking about Barton Reading and Spelling, which is our Orton-Gillingham-based protocol for dyslexia remediation. So we're going to be doing an overview of the precursor to Barton, which is Foundation and Sounds, and Barton levels 1 and 2. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can support your learner at home, and we're going to end with a question and answer time. So that's kind of our focus for tonight. As I said, my name is Rachel Herman. I'm the founder and director of Learning for All. I'm a professionally certified educational therapist, and dyslexia is an area of specialty for me. Not only do I have many professional certifications in dyslexia and related challenges, but I also have an adult son now. He's an adult with dyslexia and ADHD. So I know what this journey is like, both from the perspective of a parent and also from the perspective of a professional. And so I really get excited when I have an opportunity to talk about the principles behind understanding dyslexia and sort of demystify that process. So what is dyslexia? The word dyslexia is made up of two different parts, a root lexia and a prefix dys, something we teach our kids in Barton Reading and Spelling. The prefix dys means to have difficulty with, and lexia is the root that means words. So dyslexia in a nutshell is difficulty with words. And in particular, when we're talking about dyslexia, we're talking about a difficulty with words in print. In fact, many learners with dyslexia actually have a very highly developed vocabulary and verbal communication skills. And sometimes it can be a red flag when we see that a learner has a big disconnect between what they can do verbally and what they can do in print, whether that's in reading or in writing. So dyslexia is a difficulty with words, with written words. Some other terms for dyslexia that you will often see is dyslexia belongs to a family of learning challenges called language-based processing disabilities. So it's about the processing of language. That's where that disconnect is happening in learners who have dyslexia. You'll also see this term, specific learning disability in reading, and sometimes it'll be with or without that in reading part. But that term, specific learning disability, or SLD, is the technical term that's used in school IEPs to talk about a processing disability in one of the academic areas. So if it's in the area of reading, that's dyslexia. If it's a processing disability in the area of mathematics, that's dyscalculia. If it's in the area of writing, it's dysgraphia. And we're going to notice too that there sometimes can be overlap, or also what we call comorbid conditions. So learners might have dyslexia and something like ADHD or something like dysgraphia. So each one of our learners who has learning challenges is a puzzle of different strengths and areas to support, and understanding those strengths and areas to support allow us to create a very targeted approach for every learner. So dyslexia is actually a different brain organization for processing written language. The difference in that processing actually happens in the brain, and I'm going to show you another slide in a minute that kind of demonstrates what that looks like on a brain scan. But the language information in a brain with dyslexia actually takes a different pathway through the brain than that same kind of language activity does in a neurotypical brain. So it's a different brain organization. Children and adults with dyslexia often struggle to read fluently, to spell words correctly, and to write effectively, among other challenges. But these difficulties have no connection to their overall intelligence. In fact, dyslexia causes an unexpected difficulty in reading in someone who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. And this is something that we see all the time. This is one way that professionals identify dyslexia, and that is a disconnect between a learner's intellectual ability and their academic performance or their reading ability. That disconnect gives us a red flag that something may be going on with processing. And if that's the case, we need to make sure that we're addressing that appropriately. While people with dyslexia may be slow readers, they often paradoxically are very fast and creative thinkers with strong reasoning abilities. And this is one of the reasons that I love so much working with students who have dyslexia, because for every cognitive disadvantage, there's actually a flip side cognitive advantage in the brain. And there's no doubt about it, dyslexia is a disadvantage in terms of reading and writing. And we spend so much of the first 18 years of our life doing that, that it really is a very challenging condition for learners to work through. But for all the disadvantages that come with dyslexia, there are actually many gifts that come with dyslexia as well. And a lot of times those gifts are not things that show up the way we measure success in school. They're things that show up later in life as life skills or special talents. So we're going to talk about those in a few minutes as well. But just know that if your learner is struggling with reading, is struggling with spelling, that's only one aspect of who they are. And it doesn't reflect all of the other things that they do really well. And so we want to support both their gifts and their areas of challenge. So that's a really quick look at what is dyslexia. And I promised I would show you this slide next, which is about how the reading brain works. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to share this because I mentioned that dyslexia is a different brain organization. If you look at these two schematics of the brain and you look at the top view there, you'll notice that, that parts of that brain are colored. Okay, the parts that are colored are the parts of the brain that light up on an fMRI scan when a learner is reading. And this is what's been great about the research that we've had in the past, really about 20 years, when we've been able to take brain scans of learners while they're actually reading and see what parts of the brain are working. So that top view is a neurotypical brain. And notice that all of that thinking activity is happening in the left hemisphere of the brain. That's where most language processing happens for people who have a neurotypical brain for language processing. But if you look at that bottom level, that's the level for dyslexia. And you'll notice that completely different parts of the brain are lighting up. So rather than that processing happening in the left hemisphere, that processing is happening in the right hemisphere and in both hemispheres of the frontal lobe. So different parts of the brain are working when a person with dyslexia is reading. The long story short of that is that those parts of the brain that are lighting up in the dyslexic brain create less efficient pathways for reading. And so sometimes that process of reading gets jumbled. It becomes slower. It's a less efficient pathway than proficient readers take. And that is the biological reason for what is causing dyslexia, this disconnect between intellectual ability and reading ability. Sometimes it's easiest for us to talk about what something is by talking about what it isn't. And one of the reasons I love to talk about dyslexia is because it's so often misunderstood, and there's so many myths kind of surrounding dyslexia. And so we want to take away some of those myths by talking about the nots. What dyslexia is not, it's not a sign of poor intelligence. In fact, most learners with dyslexia have average to high intelligence. At Learning for All, we actually work with a lot of learners that have exceptionally high intelligence, but also have dyslexia or some other kind of processing challenge. We call those learners twice exceptional because they have this exceptional intelligence on the one hand, but they also have this exceptional challenge on the other. And so when those things happen together, that can be a special and especially difficult challenge to overcome. But dyslexia is not a sign of poor intelligence. It's not because of low intellect. It's because of a different way of processing. Dyslexia is not the result of laziness or not caring. And one thing that we know happens when learners are struggling, especially if they're struggling a long time in school, is that they start to put up those coping mechanisms. And if they're struggling, sometimes that can look like laziness, or that can look like willfulness, or that can look like defiance, or that can look like refusal, or that can look like they don't care. But I can guarantee you that our kids do care. They do care about being successful, and they do care about having opportunity, and they do care about our approval. And so when they're struggling, we want to look at those root causes. What's behind these things that come out sideways as behaviors sometimes in kids that are struggling in school? Dyslexia is not a disease, so it doesn't come and go. Dyslexia is not a lack of educational opportunity, nor is it a lack of exposure or education on the part of parents. That is a myth about dyslexia. Learners who have dyslexia struggle with language no matter how much exposure they have to high-level teaching methods in a classroom setting and to language at home, because their brain processes language differently. It's not able to be cured with pills or diets. There's no silver bullet to cure dyslexia. Dyslexia, if you have dyslexia, your brain will always have that different brain organization. But the amazing part that we're going to talk about when we get to the remediation is that we can retrain that brain. We can create new neural pathways where weak neural pathways exist. So that's the exciting hope that we have in when the right protocols and stimuli are applied. Dyslexia isn't an eye problem. It's not seeing words and letters backwards. People with dyslexia see language the same way as everyone else. They just, because they struggle with directionality of things in 2 dimensions, they often can't remember which direction pesky letters like B, D, P, and Q those 4 letters in English, the English language, that are all the exact same shape and just appear in a different orientation. They just can't remember which one is which and which direction they go. So we teach very specific tricks for that so that our learners can be sure of whether they're looking at a B or a D, a P or a Q, a J or a G. Dyslexia is also not something that can be outgrown. It's not a matter of not being developmentally ready to read. And in fact, if we don't address dyslexia, oftentimes we create a situation that becomes harder and harder to remediate as a child gets older. And that's what this slide is showing here. I think this graph is really helpful to think about how dyslexia affects more than just reading and spelling. More than just reading and spelling, because when a learner doesn't have good, solid access to reading, they're not reading fluently and effectively. They're not reading to learn. Once they get out of the age, which is about K through 2, where learning is, reading rather, is being taught in school. Once they get 3 is kind of a transitional grade, and then 4th and up, we're reading to learn. So in order to learn from reading, we have to be an effective reader. If by that point learners are still really struggling with reading, then the graph on the right-hand side here, the red one, starts to go into effect. So let me explain what we're looking at here. The green side is the neurotypical brain. And you'll notice that there are 2 lines in this graph. The top line is IQ and the bottom line is reading level. So as we progress through the grade levels, our IQ increases. We get smarter, we learn, we grow. Our intelligence grows as we learn in our education. So that's that top line, IQ. We expect that IQ trajectory to be on a growth trajectory. The line underneath in the neurotypical brain is the line for reading ability. And notice that in the neurotypical learner, reading ability and IQ track together. So as IQ grows, reading ability grows, and they support one another. The more you're reading, the more your thinking is going to grow. And the more you're thinking, the more your ability to read is going to grow. And so they work together to increase throughout a learner's educational experience. But for learners with dyslexia, you notice it's a different trajectory. That IQ trajectory is still on the same path. It still is going to be growing, because remember, dyslexia is not an intellectual disability. But you'll notice that that lower bar, that reading ability, will start to go up at first, but it kind of pretty quickly levels off, and it's still going up little by little, year over year, but at a much, much lower rate than what is expected. And it kind of levels off at, for a lot of our learners without remediation, around kind of a 4th or 5th grade reading level, and it can kind of stay there and get stuck. When that happens, when we're not giving appropriate intervention, that starts to pull down that top line of IQ, because what a learner gets from reading is so vital to their intellectual growth. What a learner gets from reading is vital to their intellectual growth. So it's so important to understand that words, the vocabulary and the syntax and the type of language that comes to us in print is exponentially more complicated than the language we use when we're speaking to one another. Even among college educated adults, we don't use the same level of vocabulary, the same kind of complex sentence structure and syntax as we find in writing. So the more a learner is deprived of reading ability, the more they are going to be deprived of the higher level structures and functions of language and vocabulary. So it's really important that we address this need and address it as early as we can. Here's some other facts about dyslexia. Dyslexia is hereditary. It runs in families. Dyslexia occurs on a spectrum from mild to profound. And because it runs in families, you can have, a lot of diversity within your family in the way that dyslexia might manifest. So you can have a profoundly dyslexic parent and a mildly dyslexic child, and vice versa. Or, even farther removed kind of relationships than parent and child. But there's a spectrum of dyslexia. A lot of our learners, if they're kind of on the more mild end of that spectrum of dyslexia, if we catch it early, or if they're in a school that's using a structured literacy approach, which we want every school to learn to use rather when they're teaching kids to read. But our mild kids with dyslexia, sometimes that can be enough to kind of get them over the hump of what they need to become effective and proficient readers. But for our learners that are in that more moderate to severe category of dyslexia, even with the very best classroom education, they may still need support around learning to read and becoming proficient with language, because it can be very severe. Dyslexia is common. As many as 1 in 5 students struggle somewhere on that spectrum of dyslexia. So that's about 20% of the population. And it's the most common reason that a student will be in special education. So of all the kids that have IEPs in public school special education, 70 to 80% of them have a deficit in reading. It's also the most common reason an otherwise bright student will struggle with reading and spelling. There are other possible reasons, and that's what our screenings help us to determine, is what really is the root cause of the student's reading challenge. But most of the time, that goes back to a dyslexia profile that we're talking about today. It affects males and females nearly equally. Different ethnic, socioeconomic backgrounds, different languages. Dyslexia is found in every language and country in the world, because reading is not natural to us as humans. It wasn't part of our natural developmental human process. It was something that we invented as a society to be able to record our language and make it permanent. And so therefore, it's something that comes very difficult for people who have a different brain organization. Dyslexia is often misunderstood and misdiagnosed. It affects much more than just reading and spelling, and it cannot be cured, but we can help the dyslexic brain form new neural pathways for learning. And that's the really exciting piece about it. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we move on to remediation and what works, I want to talk about some of the gifts that come with dyslexia. Because I mentioned that for every cognitive disadvantage, there's also a cognitive advantage. So it turns out that when you have trouble remembering what direction B, D, P, and Q go when they're in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper, the reason you have trouble remembering that is because you actually probably have a more highly developed sense of visual spatial reasoning. Visual spatial reasoning is an area of strength. What does that mean? That means the ability to see the world in 3 dimensions. That's actually a great gift. So our dyslexic learners have trouble with B and D because they could rotate those in their head and see them in any orientation. That's actually a gift of dyslexia. It's just a disadvantage when you're trying to figure out which one is B and which one is D. Other gifts that come with dyslexia very often: gifts in art, gifts in music, gifts of intuition, some of those intangible skills, what we call soft skills. If any of you are employees or you lead teams, you know how important those soft skills are for having a great team. People skills, mechanical skills, entrepreneurial skills, visual spatial, reasoning skills, verbal communication, curiosity, global thinking, creative problem solving, hands-on work. Some of the most creative and inventive people in the world are dyslexic. People like Steve Jobs, people like Richard Branson, people that have contributed tremendously to society because they think differently. And so we don't want to ever forget the importance of those gifts. So even though it's important to remediate reading challenges, we have to invest time and energy in that. We also want to make sure we're investing time and energy for our learners in their areas of gifting and their areas of strength, these areas that their special brain organization really allows them to shine. When we're talking about remediating dyslexia, then what methods work? So whether that's the methods that we use at Learning for All or anywhere else that you might be looking at an opportunity to remediate challenges associated with dyslexia, these are the essential qualities that a program must have in order for it to be effective for dyslexia. First, it needs to be multisensory. What do we mean by multisensory? Our brain receives input from the world around us through our senses. And for the purposes of academic learning, there's really 4 sensory inputs that we're most concerned with. And those are represented there by the acronym VATK. So those 4 sensory inputs are V, visual, what we see, A, auditory, what we hear, T, tactile, what we touch, and K, kinesthetic, when we're able to move our body in conjunction with the other inputs. So visual, auditory, tactile, and kinesthetic, those are the primary inputs that we need to gather information from the world around us. It's in gathering information from the world around us that we learn. A lot of our learners struggle with reading, our learners who have dyslexia, because they need more sensory input. They need more hooks for their brain to be able to hang on to and retain that information. So we need to present the information to our learners in a way that incorporates all 4 of those modalities at the same time in an integrated way. So when we're talking about using Barton Reading and Spelling, and most of the protocols that we use at Learning for all different kinds of things, they are multisensory, meaning they have a visual, an auditory, a tactile, and a kinesthetic component. And so that's what enables our learners to be able to hang on to and retain information that they've gotten 100 times, right, in a single or dual modality format, and that wasn't enough sensory input for them. So it needs to be multisensory, and those sensory inputs need to be fully integrated. The program needs to be systematic and sequential. What that means is there needs to be an overarching plan and structure to the program that is based on building upon blocks as you go. So we learn the first step, we start with easier concepts, and the next step builds on the first one, and the next step builds on the first one. That's what it means to be systematic and sequential. A lot of the ways that English language arts is presented in schools is not systematic enough for our learners. They develop holes in their understanding. They get some pieces and not others because maybe too much information is being presented at one time, or it's just not being presented in a logical sequence. And therefore, our learners end up missing important key foundational components of those lessons. A program that works for dyslexia needs to be mastery-based. This is another huge difference between what we do in educational therapy and what happens in school. Our learners have to master the step that they're on with a certain level of proficiency before they get the next piece. And then they have to master that one before they get the next piece. Some learners go really quickly through some parts and more slowly through others. But we know how to present that information in multiple ways so that our learner can achieve mastery of the material before we move on to the next step. And that's why the one-on-one aspect of educational therapy is so important, because that way we're able to tailor that student's progress to their rate of mastery. A program that works for dyslexia has to be explicit. It has to directly teach the principles of language, the rules for spelling. Our learners do not pick up these rules just by exposure to language. If they did, they would have no problem reading because our learners are bright and they've had a good education and exposure. So when they're not synthesizing that, when that isn't working for them, we know something else is going on, and they need an explicit approach to learning to read. What do they need? They need an evidence-based program that's based on Orton-Gillingham protocols. Orton-Gillingham is the gold standard for dyslexia remediation. It has been for over 30 years. There are multiple different approaches that are based on Orton-Gillingham. Slingerland is one, Wilson, Spire, Sunday System, Barton Reading and Spelling that we use. They're all based on Orton-Gillingham. And so there are multiple ways that we can, programs rather that we can use to teach an Orton-Gillingham protocol, but it must be Orton-Gillingham if we're working with dyslexia for it to be most effective. The other piece that's absolutely essential is to have highly trained teachers and tutors delivering that program. There is a lot of training, very specific training that goes into delivering an Orton-Gillingham protocol with fidelity, with program fidelity, meaning that we follow all the rules of implementation for the program. And it requires training, and it requires a significant understanding of what the outcomes are that we're looking for. So those are the qualities that we're looking for in a program. At Learning for All, we use Barton Reading and Spelling. So a lot of you are here as Learning for All families, or because you're interested in our program. So I want to share a little bit more about Barton Reading and Spelling. As I said before, Barton Reading and Spelling is an Orton-Gillingham based program. I've been using Barton Reading and Spelling for about 12 years now, and have found it to be incredibly effective. It's Orton-Gillingham based. I picked it specifically out of all the options. There's about 30 or so options of Orton-Gillingham programs out there on the market. But what I love about Barton is that it focuses on reading and spelling equally. And this is one thing that I found to be so true of learners, and where other programs sometimes fall short. Is a lot of programs focus on reading because reading is the most obvious and most urgent need for most of our learners. And some of those programs don't focus equally on spelling, but what we know about language processing is that reading and spelling are actually two sides of the same coin. They're two different directions of information. One is encoding, taking language and putting it into the code of English, that's spelling. And the other is decoding, taking the code that's on the page and translating it into language, that's reading. And so when our learners can do one but not the other, we find that their connection to both is not as strong. And so we want our learners to be able to spell everything that they can read. Now, all of our learners with dyslexia will be stronger in either reading or spelling naturally. Some of our learners with dyslexia are actually naturally better spellers and struggle more with the reading piece. But it's important. And so some of our learners, for example, that can spell in the context of working through the rules struggle sometimes to spell independently, or they don't maybe take the time to do that. But they have to know how to do it in order for that reading piece to also be equally solid for them. So we love that about Barton. Barton is efficient and specific. It's very easy to teach because it's very structured. And so when we follow that structure, we know that it works. It provides measurable progress for us. Each level has specific outcomes. And because it's mastery-based, Barton is self-assessing. So you don't get to move on to the next step until you've mastered the previous one. So we know right where all of our students are when they're using Barton Reading and Spelling in terms of the skills that they have mastered. We also like it because it's comprehensive. It teaches the earliest levels of phonemic awareness all the way through college level Greek and Latin roots. And so this allows us really to create a comprehensive program that will take a learner as far as they want to go with their education. So that's Barton Reading and Spelling. Barton Reading and Spelling is a wonderful program. It's a remediation program, but it's also a very intensive program. So it requires some foundational skills to be ready for Barton Reading and Spelling. So when we're screening students before they start with us and we're creating their specific therapy plan based on the results of that screening, we actually do a part of the screening that's about Barton. And that part is to see, is this learner ready to go right into Barton? And they have to have a certain level of phonemic awareness skills before they can go into Barton. If they're not quite there yet, we start with this program. And this program is called Foundation in Sounds. So this is where we start when our learners aren't quite ready to jump right into Barton. So this program improves discrimination, memory, and sequencing of sounds. Students in this program will learn to identify vowel and consonant sounds in association with picture prompts and verbal prompts. So we use more visual supports at this level to get our learners ready for Barton Level 1, where we're going to take away those visual supports and really, really flex that auditory skill of phonemic awareness. Students will identify sounds if they are tongue or lip sounds, quiet or vibrating sounds. So we teach things like brothers, sounds that are brothers. So for example, the sound and the sound B, those are brothers. Is a quiet sound, it's just a puff of air. B is a noisy sound. We actually engage our vocal cords when we make the B sound. But and B are brothers because we do the same thing with our mouth. We make the same shape. So these are the kinds of skills we teach to our learners, because by thinking about vibrating or non-vibrating, quiet or noisy sounds, by thinking about what our mouth is doing, what our tongue and lips are doing, and what the air is doing, that gives us more sensory hooks to discriminate the difference between B and P. And that helps our learners then ultimately be able to hear the difference between those sounds, manipulate those sounds, and ultimately connect those sounds to the appropriate symbols. So that's Foundation in Sounds. Whether learners start with Foundation in Sounds or start with Barton, they will go through this level, which is level 1 of Barton, focusing on phonemic awareness. This level covers without the visual symbols of language, just with colored tiles, these 7 essential phonemic awareness skills. It covers segmenting, so taking a word like cat and breaking it into its parts, segmenting the sounds, right? That's segmenting. If we want to take those 3 sounds, and put them together, that's blending. Fast like a word, cat. That's blending. Comparing, we might compare the words cat and bat. What's the difference? It's just that first sound, right? Do we have a k or a b? Our learners have to be able to identify those differences, be able to compare sounds just by listening to those different phonemes, those different letter sounds. We work on adding sounds. We work on taking them away. So what is cat without the k? That would be at. That's deleting, substituting, and finally, we work on rhyming. Rhyming means that that ending part of the word stays the same, and we only change the beginning. You'd be surprised at how many learners who struggle with this have a great difficulty with rhyming, and sometimes that's not always seen. But if you find that your learner is unable to rhyme, that is a red flag that they might be struggling with phonemic awareness and understanding and hearing the different parts of words. So in Barton Level 1, we require mastery of all these 7 phonemic awareness skills before we move on to the next level. But once our learner has achieved mastery of those skills, now we move on to level 2. And here we work on short vowels and consonants. So in level 1, we had no symbols, no alphabet symbols. In level 2, we slowly start to bring back those symbols, marrying that strengthened skill of phonemic awareness now with the visual skill of attaching that sound reliably to the correct symbol. So we do that by isolating how much information we deliver at once. So typically the lessons will have one short vowel sound and 6 consonants, and we just work with those until mastery is achieved. Then we add the next layer of another vowel and 6 consonants. And it's that restriction of the amount of information, but going all the way through the process of reading with that restricted amount of information that helps our learners master that process. So here, by the end of Barton Level 2, they will have all their consonant sounds, their vowels with keywords. They'll have the 5 most common digraphs in English that you see on the top of this tile set here, the TH, SH, CH, CK, and WH. And they'll also learn how to distinguish their tricky letters, their P and Q, their B and D. So that's Barton Level 2. And this is the scope and sequence in terms of how we are presenting those vowels and consonant sounds. So that is the quick overview of dyslexia and of Barton. A lot of our parents ask, how can we help our learners at home, our learners that are struggling with dyslexia, and particularly for families where your learners are working with us at Learning for All. These are some things we definitely want you to do at home. We want you to minimize your students' reading of uncontrolled text, especially through the end of level 3 and preferably toward the end of level 4, because the more that a learner is reading outside reading uncontrolled text, the more that they're going to be guessing at words that they haven't had yet in their Barton lessons. So we really want our learners to be focusing on texts that follow the rules we're trying to teach them in Barton. So how do we do that? That means we're going to be using audiobooks, or we're going to be reading aloud material to our students as they're learning. By the time they get solidly into level 4, toward the end of level 4, they can start picking up other texts and reading those on their own, because they will have unlearned some of that guessing behavior. But for those early levels, we want to be reading aloud to our students, and we want to discuss the stories and ask our students questions about what they're learning that they can answer verbally, because that's going to be an area of strength. We want to reduce writing assignments so that we minimize and offload that writing. And when we do have them do writing assignments, we want to disregard the spelling, because we want them to be brave with their language and feel free to write, even if it's not spelled correctly. And sometimes we want to let our learners dictate their answers to us. Because we don't want our learners taking, 3 hours to do something that should have taken them 15 minutes and having to spend so much time on that work because the writing is so laborious, for example, that, they're too fatigued to have any benefit from that. So dictating is a great way for you to help your learner offload some of that. We want to emphasize effort over outcomes like grades. We want to praise our student for the effort that they're putting in and for their specific growth as they move through the program and progress. We want to take time to feel their passions and strengths. So all of those beautiful gift areas that come with dyslexia, we want to lean in and create space for our learners to be able to participate in those activities. And finally, we want to make it multisensory. How many ways can we present this information? How many hooks can we use to hang that information on? And all of those are ways that you can help your learner be successful and help support what they're doing in their sessions at Learning for All. So I'm gonna stop my screen here so I can see you. And I think that Erin has been gathering questions. If you have questions now, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Erin's going to be monitoring that, and she's going to be sharing questions with me to answer for all of you here.
Yeah, I was going to say, if any questions come up, please throw them in. A couple questions that I will ask you, Rachel, because nothing has come in right yet, but A lot of times it is a question of, how do we, for our learners that are in the middle of elementary school or even into middle school, how do we encourage teachers or talk to teachers about uncontrolled text versus, like encouraging audiobooks, and what is that conversation? How can we talk with teachers in that sense?
That's a great question. And that is a question that comes up a lot for us because it can be really hard sometimes to manage what's happening in the classroom and what's happening in therapy sessions. And sometimes what's happening in the classroom, has learners maybe getting confused, and they come and get unconfused, and they go back to school and they get confused again, just because the method and the approach is different. So one of the things that really helps teachers understand the need to limit whether that's independent reading that's not being done with audio or something like that is, first of all, to understand that we know our learners struggling and we're getting them help, right? But that help is going to take time for all of those pieces to fall into place. In the meantime, while we're working to support those foundational reading skills underneath, we don't want our learner to lose ground conceptually. So if we are requiring our learner to get all the information they need by reading and they're not reading well, then they're going to be missing a lot of important information. And so if the goal of the task, the assignment, is to get information, right, to read a novel for information or to read a science text for information, and we're not providing any other access to that, we're not doing the goal of the assignment. So if we're reading a chapter in a science book, it shouldn't be a reading task. It should be a task about learning, about photosynthesis, right? And so how do we help our learner do that? We do that by providing accommodations, not to replace the need to learn to read, but to allow our learner to continue to progress conceptually and intellectually while we work on the reading. So one of the things, I think I mentioned it earlier, was the importance of written information and how much higher level language we use in printed material than we use in conversation. And so that's why it's so important that our learners have access to audiobooks that are at their intellectual level, not at their reading level. We want books that they couldn't read on their own, but that they're ready for the concepts, and even better, books that they're excited about with topics that they're interested in, things that get them excited about literature and reading. We want them to be listening to audiobooks for that material so that they're constantly exposed to that language that's going to stretch their vocabulary, model for them the right kind of inflection, the right kind of prosody, the right kind of reading expression. And that's going to help them to, from the top, come down with the stuff that we're doing at the lower level. And eventually those things are going to meet in the middle and help them to become better and stronger readers. So we definitely want that to be a part of their protocol in order for them to be successful. Do you have anything to add to that, Erin? I don't know if I totally answered your question. You deal with this question a lot with our families.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. A lot of times it is hard, especially with our upper elementary schools, because as Rachel had mentioned, this isn't an intellectual question. A lot of our learners do come to us in 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and even beyond, because they've been able to get by for so long. And so now we're seeing the big challenges in other areas that they've always enjoyed: math, science, social studies, because they're not able to access the material. They're not able to read the problems. They're not able to make meaning of it as easily as they were before. And so, when it comes to that point, and they are starting at level 1 of Barton, which is, where they need to start, that is a question that comes up a lot, because we want to figure out, how can we support them in bridging into, what their school content is and what they're being exposed to in the classroom, and not making them feel different, or, especially as the teachers, if they aren't aware of, the extra support they're getting or what they're really supposed to be getting, helping them understand really the systematic approach. And so, open conversations are huge. And we're always, if it is a learner that's working with us, we're always happy to talk with the teachers or email with them and, share their progress and the Barton roadmap. But even outside, just making sure that the educators that are working with them know kind of how leaning into audiobooks isn't a cop-out. It isn't an easy way out. It's, something that they really need, and something that's going to be so beneficial as they are developing these skills.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question that did come up that I just want to address to the group is thinking about diagnoses and psychoeducational assessments and things like that. We are not psychologists, so we do not provide a diagnosis. But if you do have questions about that, you can always reach out. We have a great network of professionals that we trust and refer to, that can do a full battery of cognitive and academic testing. And, often we'll kind of refer back and forth, or, a professional will refer to us. And so it's looking at their testing and being able to make meaning from it. We do still do our full functional screening as well, because we do want to get to know the student better, really see, where do they fit in our program? What specific cognitive skills do we want to target first as they're beginning? Even if, we know that they're a good fit for Barton level 1, we're wanting to start them off in Barton. We still want to, be able to come up with a complete individualized plan. So at any point, you can always reach out to me or Rachel, and oftentimes she'll refer to me. But I can share our professionals that we work with as well. I don't know if Rachel, you have anything to add on that, but that was one.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really depends on what kind of testing a learner comes with and what outcomes are needed as to whether we would refer you out for a full assessment and of official diagnosis, or whether you have what you need from the school. It's so very challenging. And I can say this from the perspective of a parent too. When you get this testing back from the school, or you get this IEP and it's this whole ream of paper, and sometimes, you might read that assessment or these outcomes and really not know at what you're looking at and what you even have. What did they even say about my child? Sometimes it's incredibly vague or very hard to understand. Sometimes, actually all the time, the language that the school uses is usually different than the language that a psychologist will use, a clinical psychologist. And so there's a lot of challenges just with making sure that we're all on the same page talking about the same thing. So that's another thing that Erin and I do a lot for families that come to us at Learning for All, is we just kind of help synthesize all this different pieces of information and kind of help demystify it for you. And we can really tell you, okay, here's what you have so far, and when we do our functional screening, you can say, yep, that's what we see, or here's what you have so far, but we did our functional screening and we're seeing, some of these things. Maybe you want to look at, specific issues with vision, visual processing, with auditory processing, or with ADHD, or with something else that maybe is coming up as a red flag. So again, as Erin said, we're not providing a diagnosis, but we are able to provide profiles and to create therapy plans around the synthesis of all these different pieces of a learner's profile. So we do that full records review. We're going to do an interview with you, and then we're going to do a couple of one or two specific sessions with your student to get some functional data to create that comprehensive plan.
Right. And then for our learners that do work with us that are in current sessions, they are going to be doing, it's not just going to be Barton Reading and Spelling. Often there are going to be other cognitive components to it. So if you ever have a question about, what specifically some of the acronyms are, or, exactly what they're working on, The therapeutic tutors try to give you an overarching explanation at the beginning, if they introduce a new cognitive technique. But that's always something that you can reach out to us, and chances are it is something that's working on building thinking skills. So those overarching, yes, they're working on reading and spelling with Barton, but they're really working on developing their thinking skills as a whole, their verbal expression, being able to come up with a plan. So that's a huge part of learning for all in general, and why we do that functional assessment is thinking, what all do we need to work on? So if you have specific questions about acronyms or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me, and I can answer that. And then the last question, I know we're just about out of time, but I do want to ask this to Rachel, and she can explain a little bit more. But the question is, well, two-part question. How long should it take for a program, to kind of reach each level? And then also, what is the best way to explain to your child kind of that their brain may work differently, how their brain works? So I know that's a bigger conversation.
Those are two questions that are really hard to give short answers to. So,
Yeah.
but definitely, I can give you some thoughts about both of those questions. So in terms of the length of the program, absolutely an important question. Hard to answer for a couple of reasons. First of all, because as we talked about before, dyslexia occurs on a spectrum. So you can have very mild to very severe dyslexia. Where a learner is on that spectrum is going to impact how much repetition is required, and therefore how fast they're able to move through the material. Because Orton Gillingham programs are mastery based, you have to master each piece before you move on. And so that has to be done at the learner's rate, whatever that rate is. So we will go as fast as our learner can possibly go through those protocols, but as slow as they need to go in order to achieve mastery. And so we're able to adjust that process depending on our learner and how they're responding. Now, if we're also talking about dyslexia plus some of these other things, dyslexia plus ADHD, dyslexia plus dysgraphia or dyscalculia, or a visual or a verbal perceptual issue, or issues with more global issues with cognition, that also sort of changes the trajectory. So what I'm going to give you is kind of a benchmark for sort of a typical straightforward dyslexia learner, but there's a lot of variation within that those recommendations. But for most of our learners, if we see a learner, we don't see any learners less than twice a week, but if we can see a learner 3 times a week consistently, we can get through all 10 levels of Barton Reading and Spelling, usually somewhere between 3 and 4 years of service. And that takes us all the way from the very first level of phonemic awareness all the way through our foreign language words that come to us in English in level 9 and our Greek and Latin roots in level 10. So that's going to prepare our learners all the way through being able to do all their high school material, all their SAT or ACT testing, and be ready for college level language. At a minimum, we want our learners to go through level 8, which takes us all the way through all of our different vowel combinations. And so really through like kind of basic high school language. So it is a process. It is not an overnight journey. And we find that we have the most success with our learners when we have consistency over time. So sometimes you look at programs that'll say, oh, it's 200 hours, we're going to do it in 10 weeks, 20 hours a week for 10 weeks, 200 hours. And, but the problem is, if you do anything for 200 hours, you're going to make a big leap at first. But but it's hard for the brain to hang on to that. And as the learner grows and changes, they may not be able to take that 200 hours that they put in all at once and be able to flex that as their needs and as their academic challenges change. And so we find we have better success, slow and steady over time. We're able to adjust the process to the learner as their needs change and as they grow. And they're able to allow their brain to synthesize that growth slowly over time so that they really get solid on those concepts. So that's kind of a very, this may be a little bit of a vague answer to that question. But again, after we do that functional screening, a lot of times we can give you a little bit more specific direction in terms of what can be expected. And what was the second part, Erin?
How do you talk to your child about their different learning or their challenges, but also their
Yes.
strengths, you know?
This is a great thing to end on, and I'm just going to give
Yeah.
a quick answer to this because I know that we have to go. But this is such a really important question, and it really is personal to your family and how you want to handle this topic. And in terms of the families that we work with, there are some families who talk specifically about dyslexia to their kids. There are some families that don't choose to do that. For my own personal preference, I think that it's helpful often to be able to name the reason for why this learner is struggling and let the learner know it's not because, they're not bright, and it's not because they're not capable, but it is because their brain just does this process in a different way. And so we need to teach them in a different way. That's not on them, that's on us. Right? That's on us as the adults in their life that care about them to make sure that we're getting them the right kind of instruction. And when they have the right kind of instruction, they will grow and they will be successful. And we see, that's a story that we tell every day over and over again in the work that we do. And that's what keeps Erin and I, coming back in the morning every day because of those stories of learners who have been successful. So oftentimes that can be very freeing to be able to say, it's not an excuse to not be able to do something, but it is a validation of, wow, this is why it's so hard. And it makes sense that it's hard because that is hard. But here are all the other pieces. I highly recommend a couple of books. Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz. It just has a second updated edition, came out in 2020. And the other book I recommend is a book called The Dyslexic Advantage by the author's last name is Eide. It's Eide, Brock Eide. And that is one of my favorite books because it talks about the cognitive advantages that come with dyslexia. So yes, there are significant challenges. We want to provide support around those, but there's also this other beautiful side. And that's a great way for you to speak life into your learner about their gifts and their talents and the potential that they have to change the world with a brain that sees things from a different perspective. So we call it the power of neurodiversity. Well, thank you. Thanks, Erin, so much.
As I say, I put my email in the chat. So if you have any more specific questions, if your learner is in our programs and you have questions about their specific programming or what they're doing, reach out to me at any point. We can set up a quick call. Or if you're just curious a little bit more, I have a list of children's books or other ways to introduce different types of learners or students that have challenges in story form. So I'm always happy to share that, or podcasts, things like that. So feel free to email me if you have any questions for our current clients or anyone else that just wants to learn a little bit more.
All right. Thank you all for being here. It was so wonderful to be with you. We hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.